There are horror movies, and then there's The Shining. A film that doesn't just scare you, it crawls into your brain, rearranges the furniture, and leaves you second guessing every hallway you walk down for the rest of your life. Directed by Stanley Kubrick and released in 1980, this is a movie so legendary that people who have never seen it still know its quotes, its imagery, and its shag carpet level wallpaper patterns. From the opening shots of Glacier National Park standing in as Colorado wilderness, to the frozen grimace of Jack Nicholson at the end, The Shining is a work that's both revered and reviled. It's been praised as a masterpiece, mocked as indulgent, accused of hiding secret codes about Native American genocide, and even treated as a confession that Kubrick faked the Apollo 11 moon landing. Yes, folks, we've officially entered the tinfoil hat section of cinema. But before we get too lost in the conspiracies, let's go back to where it all began. Stephen King's novel The Shining was published in 1977, right at the height of his early dominance. He'd already given us Carrie and Salem's Lot, and Hollywood was circling like vultures. King wrote The Shining after a stay at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, where he had a vivid nightmare about his young son running down endless hotel corridors. Combined with his own struggles with alcoholism, he turned that nightmare into one of the great horror novels of the century. Now, Stanley Kubrick was not exactly known for horror. He'd revolutionized science fiction with 2001: A Space Odyssey, turned dystopia into opera with A Clockwork Orange, and made nuclear war into comedy with Dr. Strangelove. But Kubrick had a reputation for obsession. He'd read horror novels by the dozen, reportedly tossing them aside one by one until King's book caught his eye. To him, this wasn't just a ghost story. It was a psychological drama about human fragility, addiction, and madness. King was excited at first, until he realized Kubrick had little interest in adapting the book faithfully. Kubrick hired novelist Diane Johnson to co-write the screenplay, slashing away King's characters, themes, and even major plot devices. King wanted a film about a flawed man unraveling in the grip of supernatural forces. Kubrick wanted ambiguity. Was the Overlook Hotel haunted? Or was Jack Torrance just a violent alcoholic with writer's block? Kubrick wanted both possibilities alive until the last frame. King famously thought Kubrick didn't understand horror, and thus began one of cinema's longest running feuds. By the time The Shining rolled around in 1980, Jack Nicholson had already burned his way through the 70s like a cigarette left too close to a film reel. After Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he wasn't just an actor, he was a cultural force of nature in sunglasses. Nicholson's turn as Jack Torrance cemented him as cinema's patron saint of unraveling sanity. Stanley Kubrick pushed him to the edge, and a bit beyond, often demanding take after take until Jack's manic energy was less acting and more exorcism. Off camera, Nicholson reportedly stayed up for days to maintain his unhinged aura. That famous "Here's Johnny" line, completely improvised, lifted from The Tonight Show and now forever lodged in pop culture's collective psyche. Nicholson's performance is the reason you never want to see your dad holding an axe in the middle of winter. Shelley Duvall was unlike any other actress of her time. Ethereal, vulnerable, and authentic to the bone. Discovered by Robert Altman, she became his muse in Brewster McCloud, Macabre Mrs. Miller, and 3 Women. earning a reputation for being magnetic in her offbeat sincerity. But nothing could prepare her for Kubrick's psychological boot camp. For one scene, her role as Wendy Torrance demanded 127 takes of tears, panic, and sheer terror, making it one of the most grueling performances in film history. Duval's mental and physical exhaustion shows on screen, and that's precisely what makes it so raw. Interestingly, she also hosted fairy tale theatre in the 1980s, producing whimsical children's stories after surviving one of cinema's darkest nightmares. Shelley was the emotional core of The Shining, the victim we rooted for, trapped between a possessed husband and a hotel that really needed an exorcist. Danny Lloyd's performance as little Danny Torrance remains one of the most haunting child roles ever filmed. And he didn't even know he was in a horror movie. Kubrick, in a rare act of compassion, shielded Lloyd from the true horrors of the story, telling him it was a drama about a family living in a hotel. Lloyd's wide-eyed innocence gave the film its soul, and his quiet fear, especially in scenes with Tony, his imaginary friend, still chills audiences decades later. After The Shining, Lloyd stepped away from acting altogether, eventually becoming a biology professor. He made a brief cameo in Dr. Sleep, a touching nod to his earlier brush with the Overlook. For someone who barely knew what kind of film he was in, Lloyd delivered a performance that became iconic in horror history. Before he was Dick Halloran, Scatman Crothers was already a legend. A jazz musician, singer, and actor who brought rhythm and soul to every role. His raspy warmth was known to generations as the voice of Hong Kong Phooey, and his film work with Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had already built trust between the two. As the psychic cook who shares The Shining with young Danny, Crothers became the film's moral compass. Kind, brave, and tragically human. Kubrick famously put him through nearly 150 takes for one scene, and Crothers, exhausted, supposedly cried when it was finally over. Still, he remained one of the most beloved presences on set, a bright beam of humanity in Kubrick's icy world. Joe Turkel had the kind of face that haunted you, in a good way. With sharp features and a voice that could chill a glass of bourbon, Turkel made his mark in Paths of Glory and The Killing, both early Kubrick films. By the time he appeared as Lloyd the bartender in The Shining, it was a homecoming of sorts. Calm, polite, and utterly unnerving. Turkel's performance as a spectral mixologist is one of quiet menace, an echo of the old Hollywood noir archetype with a supernatural twist. He would later appear as Dr. Eldon Tyrell in Blade Runner, making one of the rare actors to feature in both Kubrick and Ridley Scott masterworks. He retired from acting in the 1990s, but never stopped appearing at conventions, delighting fans who remembered him as the most unsettling bartender in movie history. Stanley Kubrick was less a director and more a deity of control. Known for his obsessive precision, he approached The Shining not as a horror film, but as an exercise in psychological entropy. After the success of A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon, Kubrick wanted to explore terror not through jump scares, but through symmetry, silence, and slow madness. His habit of shooting scenes dozens or hundreds of times became infamous, earning him both genius and tyrant labels. Kubrick even re-edited trailers personally and kept multiple versions of the film for different regions, fine-tuning it like a living organism. He read Stephen King's novel and promptly threw out half of it, crafting a more ambiguous, cerebral version of the story. Love him or fear him, Kubrick made The Shining a masterclass in cinematic unease. Proof that terror doesn't need blood when you can weaponize architecture, silence, and fluorescent carpets. Behind the eerie tones of The Shining lies one of the most groundbreaking composers in film history, Wendy Carlos. A pioneer of electronic music and early synthesizer technology, Carlos revolutionized sound with her 1968 album Switched on Bach, introducing the Moog synthesizer to mainstream music. Her collaboration with Kubrick began on A Clockwork Orange and continued with The Shining, where she and producer Rachel Elkind blended synthetic and classical elements into a soundscape that's equal parts ghostly and divine. Though much of her composed material wasn't used in the final cut, the haunting electronic drones that survived became essential to the film's DNA. Carlos later scored Tron, becoming one of the first composers to fuse digital and analog worlds on screen. Her influence still echoes in every horror soundtrack that hums and vibrates its way into your spine. If filmmaking is an art form, The Shining was Stanley Kubrick painting with insanity. What started as a straightforward horror adaptation spiraled into a 13-month exercise in obsession, perfectionism, and sheer endurance. A cinematic endurance test disguised as a movie. Kubrick, who famously distrusted airplanes, refused to shoot in the US, despite the story's American setting. Instead, he rebuilt the entire Overlook Hotel, down to the last carpet fibre, on sound stages at Elstree Studios in England. To the untrained eye, that might sound extravagant. To Kubrick,
but for me, it was Tuesday.
The man didn't want a haunted house. He wanted a haunted universe that he could completely control. The production team, led by art director Roy Walker, pieced together the Overlook from fragments of real American hotels. The exterior was modeled on the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, but the interiors were inspired by multiple real-life locations. The Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite for the Grand Lobby, the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, and various mid-century American lodges that screamed quiet luxury and repressed trauma. The result was an impossible architectural monster. A building that shouldn't exist, yet somehow feels terrifyingly real. Kubrick and Walker deliberately designed the hotel to feel wrong. Corridors looped into rooms that shouldn't connect. Windows appeared where no exterior wall existed, and the geography made zero physical sense. The goal wasn't realism, it was unease. The audience might not consciously notice it, but somewhere in the brain a little voice whispers, "Wait, that shouldn't be there." The Overlook itself became the film's greatest ghost, a spatial paradox that quietly drives you mad before Jack Nicholson ever picks up an axe. To enhance that creeping sense of unease, Kubrick embraced the new Steadicam technology, using it to drift smoothly through the hotel's impossible spaces. Those long gliding shots following young Danny on his tricycle weren't just technically revolutionary, they gave the hotel its personality. The Overlook doesn't just sit there, it stalks you. The camera becomes the ghost, patiently following its prey down endless patterned corridors that seem to breathe. Speaking of those corridors, the design is unforgettable. The hexagonal orange and brown carpet pattern became one of the most iconic visuals in cinema. Designed by David Hicks, it almost looks hypnotic, like a 1970s portal to hell. Kubrick insisted on bold geometric patterns, sharp symmetry, and a color palette that alternated between blood and sacrifice and interior decorators' fever dream. It's cozy and horrifying in equal measure. a place where you could sip tea, summon demons, or both. The massive sets themselves were feats of engineering. The Colorado Lounge had a fully functional working fireplace, practical ceilings, and enough space to accommodate the Steadicam rigs, which was rare for the time. Kubrick's lighting demands were equally extreme. He used wide aperture lenses and flooded the set with naturalistic light so every corner was visible, robbing the audience of comforting shadows. There's nowhere to hide. Not for Jack, not for Wendy, and certainly not for you. As the production dragged on, the atmosphere on set became as oppressive as the film itself. Jack Nicholson, already known for his intensity, leaned into the madness with gutso, improvising the now immortal "Here's Johnny" that Kubrick loved so much he kept it, even though the director had no idea it referenced The Tonight Show. Shelley Duvall, meanwhile, endured emotional hell under Kubrick's relentless direction. Her performance of panic and exhaustion made tragically genuine by weeks of psychological battering. By the time the Overlook's doors finally closed, Kubrick had assembled more than 1 million feet of film, enough to wallpaper the hotel twice. Editing would take another year, and even then he was still tinkering with cuts after the film's premiere. For Kubrick, perfection was never achieved, only chased through the snow until it froze to death. And the result? A film so meticulously constructed that even the architecture feels alive. The Overlook isn't just a location, it's a character, a predator, and a puzzle box that only Kubrick could have built. A place where geometry lies, ghosts linger, and sanity goes to check in, but never checks out. When The Shining first hit theaters in 1980, it wasn't met with the thunderous applause you'd expect for one of the most influential horror movies ever made. In fact, critics were baffled. Stephen King hated it. Audiences didn't know what to make of it, and even the Razzie Awards nominated Shelley Duvall for Worst Actress. A decision that's now aged about as well as milk in the Colorado sun. But time, like the Overlook Hotel itself, has a funny way of keeping things eternal. Kubrick's film has since become the gold standard of psychological horror, influencing generations of filmmakers from Ari Aster to Mike Flanagan. What The Shining did wasn't just scare audiences, it rewired how we feel fear. Instead of cheap jumps or gore, Kubrick targets the audience with atmosphere, symmetry, and sound. Every frame of the Overlook feels wrong in just the right way. It's a nightmare built on geometry and madness, where terror hides in the wallpaper rather than the shadows. Cinematically, the film was revolutionary. Kubrick's use of the Steadicam, pioneered by Garrett Brown, turned long floating hallway shots into visual poetry, mesmerizing and unsettling all at once. Those silent gliding chases behind Danny's tricycle became some of the most analyzed sequences in film schools worldwide. Before The Shining, horror felt immediate. After The Shining, it became hypnotic. And then there's the cultural footprint. Here's Johnny became one of the most quoted lines in cinema history, inspiring everything from The Simpsons to Ready Player One. The carpet pattern of the Overlook Hotel became so iconic it now decorates everything from doormats to socks. Even the room number 237 has taken on a life of its own, spawning documentaries like Room 237 that obsessively decode the film's supposed hidden meanings, from moon landing conspiracies to Native American genocide metaphors? Kubrick never explained, of course. He preferred his audience lost in the maze. Jack Nicholson's unhinged performance redefined the horror villain archetype. Not a monster, not a demon, but a man descending into insanity, armed only with an axe and daddy issues. Shelley Duvall's trembling vulnerability became a touchstone for every final girl that followed, from Heather Langenkamp in A Nightmare on Elm Street to Florence Pugh in Midsommar. And the pairing of Wendy Carlos's experimental electronic score with the haunting choral pieces of Desiree created an audio experience that still raises hairs 40 years later. The Shining also became a strange kind of pop culture shorthand. When a filmmaker wants to suggest someone's losing it, they often quote Kubrick's visuals: the wide-eyed stare, the long hallways, the creeping camera. It's in Black Swan, The Lighthouse, Us, even Pixar's Toy Story 3. The DNA of The Shining is everywhere, an omnipresent ghost in cinema's attic. Even its spiritual successor, Dr. Sleep, leaned heavily into nostalgia, meticulously recreating Kubrick's visual style while trying to reconcile Stephen King's original intent. It served as both sequel and apology, and it proved what everyone already knew. The Overlook Hotel isn't just a setting, it's a state of mind. Today, The Shining stands tall among the greatest horror films of all time, ranked alongside Psycho, The Exorcist, and Halloween. But where those films relied on external evil, The Shining found it within. In the end, The Shining isn't just a movie. It's a labyrinth of madness, genius, and endless reinterpretation. Stanley Kubrick didn't just make a horror movie. He built a cinematic haunted house where every hallway leads to another theory, another fear, another door we're too curious not to open. So there you have it, The Shining. A film about family bonding, cabin fever, and the dangers of typing without supervision. Stanley Kubrick's Winter Wonderland of madness still stands tall as one of the greatest horror movies ever made. A masterclass in how to make the audience question not just what they're seeing, but their own sanity while seeing it. It's a film where Jack Nicholson gave us an all-time performance in unhinged lunacy. Shelley Duvall redefined terror with a baseball bat, and Danny Lloyd became the only kid in movie history to have both an imaginary friend and a psychic hotline to the kitchen staff. But what makes The Shining timeless is how it still gets under your skin. Every generation rediscovers it, re-watches it, reinterprets it, and still ends up muttering, "What the hell was that bear costume about?" That's the Kubrick effect. He didn't just make a horror movie, he built a maze and threw us in it without a map. So tell me down in the comments, what do you think The Overlook really is? A haunted hotel? A metaphor for alcoholism? Or just a very fancy Airbnb with an axe problem? I'd love to hear your thoughts, theories, and your favourite moments, or the one scene that keeps you up at night staring at the hallway carpet. If you enjoyed this trip into cinematic madness, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next Man vs. Movies review. We've got plenty more haunted hallways and homicidal hotel guests to come this Halloween season. Until next time, keep your axes sharp, your tricycles charged, and for the love of all things holy, don't go into room 237.